The fortress city of Valkon was built on one of the deadliest planets in the known universe. Referred to simply as a death world, humans considered it largely uninhabitable, while other alien species didn't even bother attempting to conquer it. Deathworlders, the humans born and raised in these harsh environments, were a breed apart survivors to the bone, marked by their resilience and ability to adapt to even the cruelest of worlds. The man known as Jack Sloan had returned to Valkon after years away, this time with the singular mission of bringing back a living trophy. And not just any trophy, he intended to capture the most dangerous predator on the entire planet, the Morkath. The Morkath was a monstrous creature that roamed the jagged mountain ranges to the south of Valkon. It was massive, towering over trees with a thick, black pelt that gleamed under Valkon's harsh, triple suns. Its claws were like serrated knives, and its fangs could crush rock. People spoke of the Morkath in hushed whispers, as though even mentioning its name would draw its attention. The few who had survived encounters with it carried permanent reminder scars, twisted limbs, or missing eyes. But Jack wasn't deterred. He was a Deathworlder through and through, with deep brown eyes that seemed to miss nothing and a mind that thrived on strategy and perseverance. The Morkath wasn't just a prize to him, it was a challenge, one that he'd spent years dreaming of conquering. With his gear packed, Jack left Valkon's fortress walls and headed into the jagged wilderness. Days turned to weeks as Jack tracked the Morkath's trail. Signs were scarce: a broken branch here, a smear of blood there. The creature was cunning, no doubt about it, but Jack had a hunter's patience. He camped at night in hollowed-out caves, his blaster rifle kept close, always listening for the faintest sound of the beast's approach. Then, one evening, as the orange dusk cast long shadows over the mountains, he saw it. The Morkath stood at the edge of a cliff, its silhouette framed against the setting sun. Jack's breath caught in his throat. Even from this distance, he could see the beast's rippling muscles, the gleam of its jet-black eyes. It was everything he'd heard about and more, a creature born of nightmares, with raw power and primal fury etched into every line of its massive frame. But instead of charging, the Morkath simply turned and walked into a dense forest below, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. Jack's instincts told him this was the moment. He moved silently down the slope, his footsteps masked by the evening's shifting winds. When he reached the edge of the forest, Jack hesitated. The trees were thick here, and any wrong step could give away his position. He'd studied the Morkath for long enough to know that it was a solitary predator, fiercely territorial and lethal to anything that dared to enter its domain. But that knowledge was precisely why he was here. If he could subdue the Morkath, he would have accomplished something no other being on this world, or perhaps any other, had ever dared. As he stepped deeper into the shadows, he finally heard it. A low growl echoed through the trees, vibrating in his bones. Then, with a rustle of leaves, the Morkath charged from the darkness, a whirlwind of claws and teeth. Jack barely had time to roll to the side as a massive paw swiped through the air where he'd been standing. He fired his blaster in quick succession, but the creature seemed unfazed by the bolts that merely scorched its fur. "Not so easily impressed, are you?" he muttered, scrambling to his feet. The Morkath lunged again, its jaws snapping shut inches from Jack's arm. He moved with the instincts of a true Deathworlder, dodging to the left and finally landing a shot directly into the beast's side. The Morkath roared in pain, but instead of fleeing, it redoubled its efforts, charging Jack with a fury that threatened to overwhelm him. Desperation forced Jack into a risky move. He took out a sedative dart and waited for his moment. As the Morkath lunged, he sidestepped and plunged the dart into its thick fur, right below the shoulder. The creature roared, reeling as the sedative took effect. Slowly, its snarls weakened, and it sank to the ground, its breaths coming in labored, heavy puffs. Jack stepped back, heart pounding, watching as the mighty predator lay helpless before him. A sense of awe filled him. Here was the Morkath, the ruler of Valkon's wilds, subdued and at his mercy. He'd won. But as he looked down at the creature, a strange thought crossed his mind. The Morkath wasn't just some mindless predator. There was a fierceness in its eyes, a hint of intelligence that he couldn't ignore. This wasn't simply a beast to be hunted. It was a creature that had survived on this death world just as he had. Its scars, its raw strength, they mirrored his own life. For the first time, Jack considered a different possibility. What if he didn't just bring it back as a trophy? What if, instead, he tried to tame it? Taming the Morkath was an idea so absurd that he almost laughed out loud. But the thought persisted, and in the following days, he began the impossible task. Jack built a makeshift pen using thick logs and metal chains to hold the creature as it gradually regained its strength. The Morkath growled and lunged at him whenever he approached, its dark eyes glinting with hostility and mistrust. It was relentless, never letting up, its anger palpable even through the heavy sedatives Jack used to keep it calm. But slowly he worked to gain its trust. He brought it food, laying chunks of raw meat just beyond its reach until the creature grew used to his presence. Each day he stepped a little closer, never showing fear, always keeping his gaze steady. The turning point came one quiet morning. Jack approached the Morkath's pen as usual, but this time he noticed the creature watching him differently. It was no longer snarling or baring its teeth. Instead, its dark, intelligent eyes held a glint of curiosity. "You're not as wild as you want me to believe, are you?" he said softly, crouching down to look the creature in the eye. The Morkath growled but didn't retreat. Over the next weeks, Jack continued his careful approach, until one day he did something that, to any observer, would have seemed suicidal. He reached out, his hand open, and let the Morkath sniff him. The creature hesitated, its powerful nose taking in his scent. Then, almost as if deciding he was no longer a threat, it allowed him to touch its fur. Jack's hand rested on the thick, coarse pelt of the most dangerous predator on the planet. In that moment, he felt a strange bond, as though the Morkath understood him in a way few other beings could. They were both survivors of this harsh world, two Deathworlders bound by their shared resilience. From that point on, the Morkath became his silent companion. He named it Shade, for its dark fur and the silent way it moved through the forest. Though the creature still bore its wild instincts, it seemed to recognize Jack as a leader of sorts, following him through the wilderness with an almost uncanny loyalty. Word spread quickly when Jack returned to Valkon, the monstrous creature by his side. Shade moved silently at his heels, its powerful frame radiating a barely contained strength. People stared, eyes wide with disbelief, as Jack strolled through the fortress gates with the Deathworld's greatest predator following him like an obedient hound. It wasn't long before the news reached the high court of Valkon, where the powerful and elite of the city gathered to decide the fate of Deathworlders and their dominion. High Captain Alec himself summoned Jack to a council meeting, intrigued by the rumors. The council chamber was filled with murmurs as Jack entered, Shade prowling at his side. Alec, a tall, imposing man with piercing gray eyes, watched them approach with a mix of awe and apprehension. The other council members whispered, some pointing, others simply staring. "I see the stories were true," Alec said, his voice carrying a note of respect. Jack nodded, his expression calm. "This is Shade," he said simply, resting a hand on the creature's massive head. "He's no trophy. He's my partner." Alec raised an eyebrow. "A partner, you say? And what exactly do you intend to do with such a partner?" Jack met the captain's gaze without flinching. "Shade and I will continue our work, protecting the borders of Valkon and ensuring the safety of the fortress. Together, we're stronger than I'd ever be alone." The captain looked at Shade, studying the creature's fierce eyes and battle-worn body. Finally, he nodded. "Very well, Jack, but know this: if that beast ever turns on the people of Valkon, it will be your responsibility." Jack inclined his head. "Understood." Over the following months, Jack and Shade became legends in Valkon. They patrolled the fortress borders, venturing into dangerous territories that even seasoned soldiers feared. Shade proved to be invaluable, detecting threats long before they became visible, and his presence alone deterred would-be attackers. But Shade's loyalty wasn't merely born of fear or obedience. Jack knew that somewhere in the creature's wild heart, it respected him. And for Jack, Shade wasn't just a pet or a weapon, he was a companion, one who understood the unforgiving reality of their death world. And then, as the legends of Jack and his alien bear grew, a new threat emerged, one that would test the bond between them to its very limits. In the depths of Valkon's wilderness, a faction known as the Marauders began encroaching on the fortress's territory. The Marauders were ruthless mercenaries, armed with advanced alien technology, bent on carving a piece of Valkon for themselves. Unlike most threats that approached the city walls, the Marauders were organized, efficient, and lethal. They knew how to navigate the dangerous landscape, how to use the wilderness to their advantage. Rumors spread through Valkon that the Marauders were planning a full-scale assault on the fortress, something no force had attempted before. And when Alec called Jack back to the council chamber, the message was clear: Jack and Shade were Valkon's best chance of survival. Alec met Jack's eyes. "We need you, Jack. The Marauders are no ordinary threat. They're trained, equipped, and determined to take our land." Jack nodded, already sensing the scope of the challenge ahead. "Shade and I will do what we can," he replied, his voice steady. Alec's gaze flickered to Shade, who sat at Jack's side, his dark eyes sharp and watchful. Alec looked down at the Morcath, his expression conflicted. It was clear that, though he held respect for Jack, he remained wary of Shade. The beast's sheer presence seemed to unnerve even seasoned warriors. "I'm entrusting you with this mission," Alec said, leaning forward. "But this isn't just about killing Marauders. We need information maps of their camps, details about their movements. You're one of the few people here who knows Valkon's wildlands as well as any Marauder might." Jack nodded. "Understood. Shade and I will scout the territories around the fortress. We'll get the information you need." With their orders clear, Jack and Shade set out. The lands around Valkon were brutal, scarred by ancient volcanic activity and marked by dense forests and jagged cliffs. It was the perfect cover for a group like the Marauders if they weren't careful. The two of them could be ambushed just as easily as any stray wanderer. For days, Jack and Shade prowled through the wilderness, covering miles of treacherous terrain in silence. Shade moved like a shadow, blending with the thick underbrush and avoiding any stray twig or rock that might betray their position. Jack had learned to trust the Morcath's instincts, letting the creature guide him along unfamiliar paths and keeping to the safest ground. One night, as they made camp on a cliff overlooking a vast canyon, Shade growled low and quiet, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Jack followed Shade's gaze and saw a faint glimmer of movement. At first it seemed like a trick of the dying sunlight, but then he recognized it: figures in armor, their silhouettes glinting in the distance. The Marauders. Without a word, Jack adjusted his goggles, focusing on the figures. There were at least a dozen of them, armed to the teeth and moving in tight formation. Their campfires were scattered along the canyon floor, barely visible beneath the cliff's edge. As he scanned the camp, Jack's stomach twisted. The Marauders weren't just a small raiding party. This was a well-organized battalion, complete with armored transports and what looked like heavy artillery. He murmured to Shade, who was watching the Marauders as if sizing them up. "We'll get closer, but we'll have to move fast. Stick to the shadows." Together, they crept down the cliff, weaving between boulders and bushes, staying just out of sight. Jack kept his steps as light as he could, but every so often, Shade would pause, his head turning sharply, ears pricked at the slightest sound. They reached a ridge above the camp, where Jack could observe the Marauders more closely. He spotted a table covered in maps and holographic displays, with several commanders huddled around it, discussing something in low voices. He strained to hear their conversation, catching only fragments enough to learn that they were planning to storm Valkon within a week. They intended to breach the fortress from the south wall, where they believed defenses were weakest. Suddenly, one of the Marauders glanced up, squinting in Jack's direction. Heart pounding, Jack signaled to Shade, and the two of them backed into the cover of a thick pine tree. But it was too late. A Marauder guard raised his weapon and shouted, "Intruders!" In an instant, the camp came alive, weapons drawn, searchlights blazing through the darkness. Jack cursed under his breath, his mind racing. They were outnumbered, with little chance of escape if they were discovered. He looked at Shade, who was staring back at him, muscles tensed, eyes wild. Jack gripped his blaster and nodded. "Let's move." Shade charged first, a massive black shadow cutting through the darkness, his silent yet deadly presence enough to disrupt the Marauders' ranks. Jack fired his blaster, taking down 2 Marauders as Shade pounced on a third, his claws tearing through the soldier's armor like paper. The Marauders were seasoned fighters, but none of them were prepared for a Morkath. Shade's fury was an unstoppable force. He moved with terrifying speed, his claws and teeth reducing anything in his path to ruin. Jack provided cover, firing rapidly, making sure no one could get a clean shot at Shade. But the Marauders quickly regrouped, adapting to the unexpected assault. One of them shouted, "Bring out the electro nets." Jack's eyes widened as several Marauders reached for weapons loaded with electrified nets, their deadly blue arcs crackling in the night. He yelled to Shade, "Fall back, we have to go." Shade snarled, reluctant to leave the fight, but he turned and dashed toward the cover of the trees. Jack followed, firing a few more shots to buy them some time. As they broke into the dense forest, Jack could hear the Marauders close behind. He and Shade kept moving, weaving through the trees with the speed and coordination of partners who had fought side by side for years. Eventually, the sounds of pursuit faded into the distance, and they slowed to a stop in a dense grove. Jack knelt beside Shade, checking him for injuries. The Morkath's thick fur had taken most of the brunt of the fight, but there were small cuts along his side. "You did well," Jack said softly, patting Shade's head. The creature nuzzled him in response, his powerful muscles relaxing slightly. But Jack's mind was still racing. The Marauders had been more prepared than he'd anticipated. Valkon's defenses would need to be fortified if they had any chance of surviving the upcoming assault, and they had to act fast. When Jack returned to Valkon, he went straight to Ellic's quarters. The council chamber was silent as he entered, his grim expression enough to silence the usual murmurs. Shade sat by his side, his presence alone speaking volumes about the seriousness of the situation. Jack gave his report, detailing everything he'd seen in the Marauder camp. The council members exchanged anxious glances, their faces pale as he recounted the Marauders' numbers and their planned assault on the southern wall. Ellic's expression grew darker with each word. "We can't defend the southern wall against that kind of force," he muttered, clenching his fist. "Not without more firepower." One of the counselors, a woman named Mara, spoke up. "Then we should call for reinforcements from the neighboring fortress cities. They might be willing to help us." Ellic shook his head. "It would take too long. The Marauders will be here in less than a week." The room fell silent, the weight of their predicament pressing down on them. Then Jack spoke up. "We don't have to wait for them to come to us. Shade and I can return to their camp and cause enough disruption to delay their assault. We've seen their plans. If we can destroy their supplies or sabotage their weapons, we might be able to slow them down." Ellic frowned. "You're suggesting an ambush?" "Yes," Jack replied. "One they'll never see coming." The council debated his proposal, but in the end they agreed. It was risky, but with Shade's help, Jack had a chance of succeeding where an entire battalion might fail. Valkon's survival depended on it. The following night, Jack and Shade set out once more. This time they traveled light, bringing only the essentials. The goal was simple: infiltrate the Marauders' camp, destroy their supplies, and retreat before dawn. As they approached the camp, Jack scanned the perimeter, marking the guards' positions. Shade crouched beside him, his black fur blending perfectly with the shadows. "All right," Jack whispered. "We need to be quick." Together, they slipped past the guards, moving with the stealth and precision of seasoned hunters. They reached the Marauders' supply tents, where rows of crates were stacked, filled with rations, medical supplies, and ammunition. Jack motioned to Shade, who slunk into the shadows, ready to strike if necessary. He worked quickly, planting small explosive charges along the base of the supply crates. They were timed to detonate in 15 minutes, just enough time for him and Shade to get a safe distance away. As he finished setting the last charge, a voice called out behind him. "Hey, who's there?" Jack froze. Slowly, he turned to see a Marauder guard approaching, his weapon raised. Before the guard could react, Shade leapt from the shadows, tackling him to the ground. The guard barely had time to scream before Shade's powerful jaws silenced him. Jack nodded to Shade in thanks, and they sprinted toward the edge of the camp. They'd just reached the cover of the trees when the first explosion rocked the camp. Flames shot into the sky, followed by the sounds of shouts and chaos as Marauders scrambled to contain the fire. Explosions ripped through the supply tents, reducing the Marauders' rations and ammunition to smoldering ruins. Jack grinned, adrenaline coursing through his veins. They'd done it. But then, as they retreated further into the forest, he heard a low hum, a sound that made his stomach twist with dread. He turned to see a group of Marauders in pursuit, their hovercrafts closing in on them fast. They were outnumbered, and this time there would be no easy escape. Jack looked at Shade, whose eyes blazed with fierce determination. "This is it, buddy," he said, drawing his weapon. "One last stand." Shade growled, his body tensed and ready. As the Marauders closed in, Jack and Shade stood side by side, ready to face their enemies head-on. Blaster fire erupted as the Marauders' hovercraft circled, pinning Jack and Shade down in a hail of bullets and energy beams. Jack fired back, aiming for the vehicle's engines, while Shade charged into the fray, his powerful form a dark blur among the trees. The Morkath was relentless, tearing through Marauders with lethal precision. But the Marauders kept coming, more organized and better armed than before. It was a grueling battle, one that left the forest littered with broken branches, scorch marks, and fallen soldiers. Jack and Shade fought with everything they had, refusing to give an inch of ground. Then, just as hope began to dwindle, a familiar sound echoed through the trees, a battle horn, the signal of Valkon's reinforcements. To Jack's astonishment, Alec and a battalion of Valkon soldiers burst onto the scene, weapons blazing as they flanked the Marauders. The reinforcements tore into the enemy ranks, driving the Marauders back with a ferocity that turned the tide of the battle. In the chaos, Jack spotted Alec, who nodded at him with a look of fierce pride. "You held them off long enough for us to arrive," he shouted. "Valkon won't forget this." With the reinforcements' help, the Marauders were quickly overpowered, their forces scattered and broken. By dawn, the remaining Marauders had fled, and the forest was quiet once more. After the battle, Jack and Shade returned to Valkon as heroes. The fortress was saved, and the council honored Jack for his bravery and resourcefulness. But as they celebrated, Jack knew that he and Shade had forged something far more profound, a bond that went beyond mere survival. Shade, once the most dangerous predator on the planet, was now his partner in every sense of the word. Together, they were more than just Deathworlders, they were legends, a testament to the power of loyalty and trust. And as Jack looked at Shade, he knew that they would face whatever challenges the Deathworld threw at them together. In the weeks following their victory, Valkon experienced a rare period of peace. The Marauders had been driven back, and whispers of Jack's victory spread across the fortress. People came from the far reaches of Valkon to catch a glimpse of the man who had tamed the Morkath, a creature once considered untamable, and turned it into a trusted companion. Shade, meanwhile, had become a legend in his own right, his very presence inspiring awe and admiration. One evening, Jack stood on the southern wall of the fortress, overlooking the sprawling wilds beyond. Shade sat beside him, his gaze steady and calm. The city had come to accept the Morkath as part of Valkon, and now soldiers even trained alongside Shade, learning tactics that Jack and his beast had used to hold back the Marauders. Shade's keen senses and raw power had inspired a new approach to combat, one that leaned into Valkon's natural landscape rather than resisting it. But as the quiet stretched on, Jack felt something shift within him. For as much as Valkon was his home, he felt the call of the wilderness stronger than ever. A Deathworlder at heart, he yearned for the rugged freedom of the wilds. Alec sensed it too. The High Captain, now a friend, met Jack one evening in the council room, offering him a drink as they sat together in quiet understanding. "You've given Valkon a great gift," Alec said, breaking the silence. "The walls of this city have never been safer, and the people they see a symbol of strength in you and Shade." Jack nodded, accepting the praise. "Shade and I belong out there," Alec said, gesturing toward the wilds. "We'll always protect Valkon, but we're not meant to be confined to these walls." Alec looked at him, his face a mix of respect and regret. "Then go with my blessing," he said, gripping Jack's shoulder. "You and Shade will always be part of Valkon's story. and if we ever need you, we know where to find you." The decision made, Jack prepared for one last gathering. The fortress was alive with activity as the people of Valkon gathered in the courtyard, eager to celebrate the duo who had saved their city. Torches blazed, casting a warm glow over the stone walls, and music filled the air as people shared stories of Jack's battles, of Shade's bravery, and of their unbreakable bond. As the celebration wound down, Jack addressed the crowd, expressing his gratitude to the people of Valkon for their support and trust. "Shade and I have faced the wilds and the threats that lurk there, not because we're fearless, but because we know that no matter what, we're never alone." He looked down at Shade, who nuzzled his hand in response, a soft rumble escaping the creature's throat. With that, Jack and Shade left the fortress walls, slipping into the night like shadows, heading for the mountain ranges where few dared to tread. They traveled through dense forests, crossed rushing rivers, and climbed towering peaks, exploring the untamed world they both belonged to. Over the years, sightings of Jack and Shade became the stuff of legend. Hunters would spot them moving silently through the forests, protecting travelers from unseen threats or driving off creatures that posed danger to Valkon's settlers. Their presence became a symbol of hope, a reminder that the wilderness, though unforgiving, had protectors who understood its every shadow and sound. Even in the fortress, soldiers spoke of Jack's tactics, and Shade's methods became the basis of a new fighting style that merged human strategy with primal instinct. Jack's legend grew with every retelling, becoming the myth of the Deathworlder and his Morkath, who roamed the wilds not as conquerors but as guardians. And so, their legacy endured, two creatures bound by their shared respect and loyalty, defending their world with the quiet strength of those who knew what it meant to survive. Jack and Shade, the Deathworlder and his beast, had become part of the very fabric of Valkon itself,